Welcome to the weekly podcast of First United Methodist Church in Costa Mesa, California. Founded in 1912, the church gathers on Sundays at 10 a.m., and we invite you to join us anytime. For more information, visit our website, costamesafirst.umc.com, or connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter.
So last week we asked the question, what is most true about God? And as you heard, that there's a lot of folks who kind of think through this, but until you're asked the question, what is most true about God, you might not have an answer. Like if you think of this divine or sort of understanding of what God is, what is most true about God is a different question than what is God or who is God. But last week, as we dove into what is most true about God, we discovered what? That God is love. So we talked a lot about what does that mean, and when we say that, isn't that lovely? It should be on a t-shirt, right? And we know that is true and is in the Bible, right? And so it seems like God is love, but if that is true, we should be a much more loving community and culture. Oftentimes, Christians are not known for being very loving. So this week, we're going to talk a little bit more about what's most true about us. Years ago, I went down to San Diego to hang out with some of my friends. And do you have those like super deep friends that say things that like make you pause and like you drive home just thinking about the thing that they said? I have two friends like that. One is named Tasha and the other one is named Allie. And they are just these really deep people. They have done something called I think it's called the Living School, where they met with this guy named Father Richard Rohr and they sat at his feet. These women are just filled with depth. Just super deep people. Now I'm going to tell the start of this story. It has nothing to do with the sermon other than I think it's funny. I was walking with them in San Diego and having this very, very deep conversation. And as we walked, it was only then that we noticed that no one else was wearing clothing because we accidentally had been so caught up in our conversation that we had walked onto the one nude beach in all of that area. Now, why that's funny is I'm standing with these like super deep theological women, and one of them just says, well, that's aggressive, as a naked man is just walking towards us. Even in that, she's calm. So we survived that moment, and we went to dinner together, and as always, our conversation was pretty great. And then all of a sudden, Tasha stops us and says, I have a question for you. What is the thing that you know to be absolutely true about yourself? What? I wasn't ready for that. What is the one thing you think to be true? Absolutely 100% today you believe is true. Now, these are some really deep people, so I was thinking, is this like an existential question? Like, I don't know how am I supposed to answer this? How can I look smart? I was thinking through all of these things, and I started to think, what is most true about me? Something I know to be absolutely true. So I said something like, my eyes are blue. And she said, well, that's actually, and I started to explain how sometimes they're blue, sometimes they're not. I was like, okay, fine. She says, no, something more. What is most true about you? I want you to think about that for yourself. If someone were to ask you, and someone should ask you at lunch, what is most true about you? What would you answer? Eventually, as each person shared, I shared something that hit me at a level that I wasn't prepared. I said, what I know to be most true is that my parents love me. Isn't that a strange thing? But that's what came to me. I know no matter what, and this is really interesting, I know no matter what, my parents love me. Now, the next question was a hard one, which was, what is love? What do you mean your parents love you? What do you mean by love? And I think as we talk about love, love is really a difficult thing to talk about because we are constantly told what love is, right? From TV shows to quotes to, I love a good sappy love song. I found out the other day that Sean Fullerton, who comes to this church, he loves good breakup songs, which I think is hysterical. He's like, oh, it's so easy to write a love song, but a good breakup song. And Sean's wife was like, what? It's like, I love a good breakup song. We're taught in so many different ways what love is, but it's really hard for us to understand what love is. Recently, I'm in the midst of a book deadline, so what happens for me is that means that I write, and then I walk around my house a lot, and then I find shows on Netflix. So I found this show on Netflix called Atypical. Has anyone seen this? Yeah. Atypical is the story of he's a teenager, and it's told from his perspective, which is really fun. He's a teenager who is atypical neurologically. He is on the spectrum for autism. And as he is sort of living through life, you're getting to experience how it affects every single one of his family members. And as he kind of is trying to figure out what it means to be a teenager, he starts dating a girl. And this girl is incredible, by the way, because she's dating this young guy who all he wants to talk about is penguins. One of my favorite episodes, she keeps making him give her things whenever he talks about penguins because he's learning to not talk about penguins. He's this wonderful character, and you love him. And he's trying to figure out, she accidentally tells him that she loves him, and he goes, he doesn't know how to respond to it. And so he meets with his parents, and he asks them, what is love? How do you know if you love someone? So they give him 3 ideas of how to know what love is. They say, it's the first person you think of when you wake up. And then the next thing they say is, it's the person that makes you a better person. Oh, some of you guys who are married are looking at it. This is cute. The third, okay, so it's the first person you think of when you wake up. The second, for me, that's like a taco, so I don't know how that works. The second thing is they make you a better person. Now I'm discovering I think tacos really fill all of these for me. The third, right? The third is that when something exciting happens, they're the first person you want to tell. So this wonderful character, he figures out all these things are true of the girl that he likes, and the poor girl, because she just keeps getting told weird things like, you're the first person I thought of this morning. And she's like, okay. Like he just doesn't know how to weave together that this is him trying to figure out if he loves her. So then he check marks all of those things and says, I love you. But what happens next is that he encounters his therapist, who he actually has this really big crush on, and he realizes he doesn't actually love his girlfriend the same way that he loves his therapist. See, if we look at love and we use all these check marks, these things that we're told to think about love, it's difficult for us to understand what love is. So for us to say that God is love, and then for even us to say that, we are loved by God, it's really difficult if we don't know what healthy love looks like. If you've done any studying of therapy, there's something known as the attachment theory, okay? So there's, and I love my therapist in the front, and the people who are studying communications just read a book on the attachment theory. So there's this idea that there are 3 different types of people in the world. Securely attached people, who most likely their parents were really good at letting them know they were loved. Anxiously attached people, who are those folks who just constantly want everything to work out because they're so afraid because their parents didn't do a very good job of showing different kinds of love. By the way, most of us are in the anxious, right? No matter how great our parents were, somehow we figured out that we have to work really hard for love. And then the third one is avoidant attachment, which are like, yeah, no, I'm not gonna do that, right? And we all fit into one of these characters, like one of these 3 different ways. Because when we don't know what love is, we try to figure it out, we try to work it out. And all of us have experienced at some point of our lives being one of these 3 different kinds of attachment. So how do we play that into our understanding of God? I think we all have moments when we're in one of these 3 stages in our relationship with God, right? We can be avoidantly attached when we ask some of those folks, what does it mean? Who is God? And how do you feel about it? Their response wasn't about God, was it? It was about them. I don't really believe in God, man. Or here's where I'm at. Like I see God and all this nature and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's where we're sort of avoidantly attached. We're not sure how we feel about the love of God. And then there's some of us who are anxiously attached, just so afraid that at any moment the love of God could be taken away from us. And that's often helped by some of the theology we've been taught, right? If I just do this much, then I will be loved, right? We kind of base it on our human relationships where if I can just do this thing, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about where some of that came from for some of us. And then there's this third sort of view of our relationship with God, which is this securely attached, which I think is beautiful, which is this idea that God loves me. And it's such a small thing to say, God loves me and I know it to be true, but it absolutely defines who we are and how we exist in the world. We can't check boxes off to get there. Now, I think a lot of us got in these sort of weird ideas about who and what God is and what love is because of this idea of original sin. Have you guys heard, right, the original sin theory? Different denominations have been based just around this idea of original sin. Now, a lot of folks say, well, that's been around since the beginning of Christianity or even the beginning of Judaism. But what's interesting is if we look even at the language of original sin, it really didn't start coming around until the 2nd century with Irenaeus. You can Google this stuff, guys. It's fun. Irenaeus, right? That's the beginning of this conversation or this idea that Adam and Eve at the very beginning, something happened that makes all of us incapable of anything but being sinful. The fall is in all of us. Augustine continued to talk about this, and more that kind of bled into understanding, and really around the time of the Reformation. This is your history lesson. Some of you have zoned out, but I think it's important us to understand that this idea that we are fallen and broken at our very base and identity really says a lot about how we see ourselves and others. Many people's religion seems to suggest that what's most true about me is that I am sinful. You'll hear this word, total depravity. The very base of me is sinful. And that's beautiful in some ways because then we can see God's grace as this loving, this sinful, broken person. And yes, we all have these things. But I wonder if the story of Adam and Eve, what's most true about them is that God loves them. How would it make it different for us to see our biggest identity, our real identity is being loved by God? How would we offer that to other people instead of seeing it as our base identity is that I am broken and harmful and so I need God to fix it? Now I think there are parts of us that is true, but what if we didn't have to work for it? What if who we are is the beloved? That's it. How does that change? And what we learn in psychology about attachment theories is those folks who live with what's known as just sort of a presence of not even worried about it, just attachment is easy to do. They're the people who are the healthiest. People who are capable of just saying, I'm loved, you're loved, we're good. The base level. You are the beloved. That's kind of the idea of baptism. It's an outward reminder that from the very base of ourselves, we are the beloved with whom God is well pleased. And it's interesting because Paul talks about this. You know, we've talked a lot about Paul in the last couple of weeks. We talked about the story of Paul when he was Saul and turns to Paul, right? We talked about how that story oftentimes is told this really sinful man becomes this really great man. But what we need to hear more than that is someone who is trying really hard to get religion right? Paul would have been a hero amongst those around him because he was trying desperately to keep things the way they were and to have a holy space. He was not a guy who was separated from the idea of God. He simply was trying in the wrong way to maintain that relationship with God. And we talked about how Jesus came in and said, hey, dude. Well, he didn't say, hey, dude, that's my version. But he said, look, there is something different. You've missed out on the peace. And those people that you once were hating, I want you to join because those are my people. And it's this beautiful moment where Saul sees himself differently as Paul. And so when Paul writes these words about nothing can separate us from the love of God, you have to understand how powerful that is for him. Someone who was once trying so hard to maintain that relationship with God by keeping holiness practices, by doing what he hoped and thought were all the right things, for him to say, no. At a base level, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. How incredible and powerful that would have been. Especially if you think about the idea that so many people around us are always trying to get it right. You know, recently there was just this storm of folks who were asking me, and I shared with you about how can pastors and churches take care of the women in their congregation. And I said, look, it's not about taking care of or protecting the women in their congregation. Really, what we want to talk about is how can we empower everyone, including the women in your congregation. And so I made a list of things that I thought that would be helpful for folks to do. One of them was quote female theologians. So friends, I'm about to quote one of my favorite crazy mystics, all right? Julian of Norwich. I know you guys are all fans. 1345 to 1416 is when she lived. She lived as what was known as an anchoress. If you don't know what that is, it's kind of like a nun, but it's more like someone who's just sort of set apart. And she wrote a book called The Revelations of Divine Love. And she wrote this in 1395. Why does that matter? Because it's the first book in an English language ever to be written by a woman. And it was about this idea of divine love. And so Julian had this experience where they thought she was passing away, and so they brought in the priest to do the last rites, and she actually survived, and she had all these visions of Jesus, and she wrote about him. And this is what she says after encountering Jesus at the foot of her bed: the greatest honor we can give Almighty God is to live gladly because of the knowledge of his love. Just like children who aren't worried about their parents' love are the healthiest. We, as humans, who aren't worried about the love of God because we know that's our base essence, are filled with joy and can live gladly. What does that look like? This is one of my favorite writers. If you get a chance to read Frederick Buechner, he is, some say Buechner, I'm probably saying his name wrong. Secrets in the Garden, he says this: we are above all things loved. That's the good news of the gospel. And love not just the way we turn up on Sundays in our best clothes, clearly he's not been here, our best behavior and with our best feet forward, but loved as we alone know ourselves to be. The weakest, the shabbiest of what we all along with the strongest and the gladdest. To come together as people who believe that just maybe this gospel is actually true should be to come together like people who have just won the Irish sweepstakes. It should have us throwing up our arms around each other like people who have just discovered that every single man and woman in those pews is not just familiar or an unfamiliar face, but is our long-lost brother, our long-lost sister. Because despite the fact that we have all walked in different gardens and knelt at different graves, we have all, humanly speaking, come from the same place and are headed into the same blessed mystery that awaits us all. This is the joy that is so apt to be missing, and missing not just from churches, but from our lives, the joy of us not just managing to believe the least part of the time, at least part of the time, that it is true that life is holy, but of actually running into that holiness head on because you are loved. Friends, such a silly little sentence, God loves me. But it changes the way we exist and are in the world. You know, we talked about our vision statement being First United exists to remind us that we are already loved by God and called into genuine relationship as we follow the radical way of Jesus. We were really careful as a leadership team about the language that we used. Reminded that you're already loved by God. that changes our theology. It changes the way we are in the world. If we believe that we see everyone else as already loved by God, it's such a different way of being. I wonder if you would, just for a moment, I'm going to invite the music team forward. I want us to just have just a time of prayer, just for a brief moment. I want us to, if you could believe just for this moment that you are already loved by God. For those of you who pray with your eyes closed, great. For some of you who maybe want to write this down, awesome. Feel free to write it inside of your bulletin or wherever you want to write it. But I just for a minute want to bring us closer to the presence of God. If you were going to hear God say something over you, if you were to believe audaciously today that God already loves you, would you hear the divine saying to you? Do you hear the divine saying that you are enough? Perhaps you are hearing the divine say this morning that you got to stop working so hard and just be present. Do you hear the divine saying your name like a dear friend? If you have a difficult relationship with your family, what would it look like to believe that God is different than that? What would it look like this morning to believe that nothing can separate you from the love of God? Who you are is the beloved, with whom God is well pleased and delights over you. What is the one word or sentence that you feel the divine saying to you? Gracious God, as we sit here in a moment, we're going to start singing, and we may stay seated or we may want to stand, however it might be, however we want to respond. Lord, we want to be bold this morning to believe that you love us already. And for all the ways that we've strived and hoped that we could somehow win that, God, that's not how you love. So this morning, God, we ask to hear you and to trust that it is your voice that we're hearing. God, you are so gracious. And you show up. Lord, for those of us who have a tough time believing you're real, just even for today, could we believe that you're not only real, but that you are proud of us and you love us? God, we seek to know you more and more. Amen.